Welcome. This video is about the poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. You will find this poem on a few GCSE anthologies, but the poem is interesting in its own right. I'm going to analyse it and show you what you should learn about the poem using these headings. This will allow you to compare different aspects of poetry, so it makes sense to explore them in a memorable way. You can also use these headings for an essay plan, and if you do cover them, you should have everything that you need to get a top grade. If you want to create a mind map of this poem, you could also use a template like this. Pause if you want to copy it and fill in as you go. I will always use the same headings, so if you want, you can build up a bank of these mind maps for all the poems. Okay, first up is content and meaning. This is here to help you secure the poem in your memory. You need to know what happens, what it's about, and what it means. So this is the one where the narrator meets a traveller from an antique land, which deduction tells us is Egypt, and the traveller tells him about a statue in a desert. The statue is broken, toppled or decayed, and bears an inscription that identifies it as Ozymandias, also known as Ramesses and Ramses. Ozymandias was a big thing in Egypt over 3,000 years ago. He was one of the greatest pharaohs of ancient Egypt and left many monuments to himself, including large parts of Karnak and Luxor. He was also featured in the Bible and the Quran. The traveller reveals that the inscription by this broken statue reads as a boast, saying that he has achieved a great deal and others should be envious. But all around, the traveller describes the vast emptiness of the desert, and that emptiness is mirrored in the empty boast of the statue. The poem is largely ironic. It presents Ozymandias as boastful of his achievements, but his statue is crumbled and broken, laying in the sand as a reminder not of the power of Ozymandias, but as a reminder that time will conquer every enemy. Nature is more powerful than the human will, and in the grand scheme of things, the pompous and powerful will also be reduced to nothing. The conflict in this poem is with authority, with those who have extreme power, like monarchy or emperors, the equivalent of pharaohs in Shelley's contemporary experience. I'm assuming that you've read the poem, so let's jump straight into analysing it. Beginning and ending. Structure is one of the elements in literature mark schemes, and one useful way to consider structure is the order of the ideas. In this section, we'll consider how and why the poem begins and ends the way it does, and I'll give you some useful pointers to learn. The opening of the poem creates the impression that the narrator has a strong voice. I met a traveller from a distant land. It's clearly a narrative poem written in the first person, and yet it's only a narrative framing device, really, because the mystery traveller gets the rest of the poem. That's 13 lines of the 14-line sonnet, not told by the person who appears to be the narrator. The reader, then, is cast with the original speaker, the I of the first line, discovering the story of the statue alongside him, witnessing the truths as told from this distant land. It's always worth considering the ending of the poems, as the poet will carefully consider what to leave the reader with, and what they want the reader to think about after the poem ends. The ending of Ozymandias is interesting because it leaves the reader with the impression that Ozymandias was a fool to believe his power would extend beyond his life. He writes his own epitaph. An epitaph is a phrase written about someone who has died, usually in the form of an inscription on a gravestone, and it's clearly boastful, so the poet ends instead with a contrasting image of the lone and level sands stretch far away. The alliteration of the L, which is sometimes called a liquid sound, in the lone and level, slows the pace at the end of the poem, and this then combines with the sibilance of the sand stretching, nodding to the wind over the sand and how it moves to emphasize the sheer size of the desert. It's vast, lonely, and lasts far longer than any statue. Form is about the aspects of writing that are specific to the way poetry works, like the type of poem, the rhyme and the rhythm. Structure in poetry is the way the poet organises the elements of the poem, the order, as well as overlapping with form when considering stanza organisation and rhyme. By discussing the beginning and the end of the poem, we have already established some structural elements. So what I do here is explore the relevant aspects of form and structure that can be linked to analysis. And that's exactly what you have to do in an exam. The poem is a sonnet of sorts. A sonnet is a 14-line poem, usually dedicated to someone that the poet loves. There are different structures that a sonnet writer can use, such as an octave to establish the problem, followed by a sestet, which deals with the solution. That's 8 lines and then 6. We call this the Petrarchan sonnet form, and sometimes the octave is split into 2 separate quatrains. That moment of change in direction from the problem to the solution is called the volta. The other big sonnet form is the Shakespearean sonnet, which has 3 quatrains followed by a couplet, with the volta before the final couplet. Shelley's poem looks most like the Petrarchan sonnet. It has an octave and a sestet rhyming A, B, A, B, A, C, D, C, and then the sestet becomes E, D, E, F, E, F. The rhyming scheme is unusual, and what is most noticeable is the 7th line within the octave and the 10th line rhyme, so it bleeds from the octave into the sestet. The volta does appear to be in place, as there is a change in direction beginning in line 9, where the inscription is related, and the tone changes to acknowledge the irony of the inscription. The poem is largely iambic, meaning it has an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed one. This changes for lines 11 and 12, which contain the command and comment. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. What we're seeing here is a move away from the iambic. We call poetry iambic when the first syllable is unstressed and the second one is stressed. That's actually the normal flow of the English language. That's an iamb. In iambic pentameter, we have 5 iambs, sometimes called feet, so 10 syllables in total. A trochee is an iamb in reverse, a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. I normally explain this using William Blake's poem Tiger, Tiger, because the first line of it is Tiger, tiger, burning bright. That's Blake's spelling, by the way. We can't say tiger without stressing the first syllable. It's tiger, not tiger. Here, if we inverted the stresses, the line wouldn't work either. Lines 11 and 12 use a trochee at the start to unsettle the rhythm. Shelley emphasises the imperative, highlighting the self-centred nature of Ozymandias and his commanding nature. Now look back at the preceding line. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. The stresses are deliberately irregular here. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. There are 11 syllables here. That's not by accident. Shelley could have changed the line to I am Ozymandias, perhaps at the beginning, to fit in a neat pentameter, but he deliberately subverts that to show the hubris of the king. The question, I suppose, is how to relate this to anything that might be relevant to the poem without getting lost in the poetry geekery, which obviously I quite like, but it does need to relate to the poem itself, and you need to find a way to express that in an exam. So here's my take in handy bullet points. The sonnet form is decayed to reflect the statue. That's what people normally say. That's great, it's snappy, and it's short. But why not use that as a possible interpretation and add that Shelley uses the sonnet form because it's ancient and because in many ways the poetic form will outlast us all and the statue. The idea of a sonnet to describe a statue is mocking the idea of vanity itself, as sonnets should be love poems, usually for romantic love or love of God, and Ozymandias seems to love only himself. The sonnet is reformed anew then by Shelley, and that allows Shelley to explore the power of ideas that live on in people's minds rather than the vanity of statues. The volta allows the poet to refocus, reflect on the power of time and nature. The use of the trochaic, the adjective for trochee, the trochaic meter draws the reader's attention to the boastful epitaph and makes it seem different and strange. The disruption of the natural meter reflects the disruption in nature caused by Ozymandias' hubris. In the end, the rhythm is restored, as is the power of nature. Shelley wants Ozymandias to come across as cruel, and more precisely, pointlessly cruel and foolish, to think any of his struggles will matter in the long run. So let's have a look at the language in the inscription on the pedestal. It reads, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." The beginning and end of the sentence contain imperative verbs, symbolically wrapping up the sentence in commands. Look and despair. We've already talked about the stresses. The accents of the rhythm accentuate the imperative. So let's think more closely about how the words work. It is a command, but it reaches over the centuries into what would be Ozymandias' future, intending to command not only the subjects of his life, but very specifically the subjects beyond his life. The idea of hubris is relevant here. I've mentioned it already, but hubris is the idea of a deeply held notion of one's own self-importance, a sort of pride that goes beyond what's normal and healthy into an unreal arrogance. When we see pride in tragedies, it is always punished, and the old proverb, "pride comes before a fall," is said a lot for a reason. In a mythological sense, hubris is committed when people believe they are gods or have godlike powers, and they're always punished for this. Think Icarus flying too close to the sun, and so with Ozymandias. He believes himself godlike. He depicts himself as a god, and Shelley shows his downfall. Shelley shows his downfall with irony. He's telling other mighty kings to admire the size of his statue and despair. And yet, when he's described to us, we see him as the shattered visage, meaning the broken face of his own hubris. The despair, then, should belong to Ozymandias, not the reader, since his beliefs are all wrong, and because power is only temporary. The broken statue is symbolic of the order that was imposed by selfish cruelty, and that order has also broken down. There is a higher power, and for Shelley, it's not God. The higher power is nature and time. We've already explored the final image, the lone and level sands stretch far away, so let's finish by just adding that the desert is vast, but it is also timeless, stretching far away into the future. The idea behind this section is to give an easily identifiable point that you can use to explore the presentation of feelings, and use as a starting point to compare the presentation of feelings in other poems. Shelley wants the ruling class, something he consistently rebels against, to come across as arrogant. One way he does that is to use the statue as a symbol of uncaring and selfish, self-serving and self-interested ruling class. So we're presented with a statue that depicts a cruel ruler whose face has a sneer of cold command. A sneer is a disdainful, mocking smile. It has connotations of superiority, a smile that doesn't care and doesn't need to. It is devoid of the joy that you might associate with a smile. Cold command is alliterative. If you're ever stuck about what to say about alliteration, start with it being emphatic. It emphasizes something, and in this case, it emphasizes the coldness of the ruler. Then think about what kind of sound it is and see if that backs up what's being emphasized. And in this case, the very sound of the sea is a harsh, guttural sound that adds to the tone and reinforces the idea that Ozymandias does not care about the people. It echoes the King of Kings that's coming in a few lines' time and doubles down on that harshness. Don't forget, that it's the artist, the sculptor, who has captured this cruelty, and either Ozymandias agreed with it and liked his haughty depiction, or he was so superior that he didn't even recognize that he was already being mocked by the sculptor. So we've picked out one specific point that you can use to explore feeling, and it's a good starting point to compare feelings in other poems. As always, there are others, and some of that is going to come through in the imagery. I hope you found that useful. There will be more poems coming, so I hope you'll be back soon.